Clara Bow is probably a name that you might have heard of in recent pop culture. Taylor Swift released her Tortured Poets Department album, and on it she had a song called Clara Bow. And this caused a lot of people to question who Clara Bow actually was and why she became so famous. In this episode, this is exactly what we are going to be addressing. But of course, firstly, I am Gabrielle McMaster. I'm an author and historian, and I am here to take you through the weird and the wonderful histories that you may not know or the stories you may not have heard of. Clara Bow was known as the first ever it girl. And this is not because of her popularity and her beauty, although that became very prevalent to her fame story, but it was because she starred in a film in 1927 called It. She became known simply as the It Girl. But how did she become so popular and famous in the jazz age, when the flapper was prevalent in their popular culture and of course their film industry? How was Clara so famous, even though she was surrounded by people who were dressed similar and had very similar fashion sense in terms of beauty and hairstyle as well? Well, this is exactly what we are going to be looking at today. And we're going to start off by looking at Bow's childhood and what in her childhood impacted her in her fame story. Clara Bow was born in a tenement building in Brooklyn in New York. No one actually expected Clara Bow to make anything of herself. This was due to the fact that she lived in abject poverty, and she had a very, very bad childhood, not only due to the poverty, but also due to tragic events which took place at the time as well. For example, her mother had schizophrenia and her father did sexually abuse her. She also watched her friend dying in front of her, and all of these events really did impact Bow in her life and eventually with her acting and all that came with it as well. Bow always dreamt of getting out of Brooklyn and escaping all that she grew up with, the poverty and the people that were around her as well. To try and get escape in those very hard times in her life, she relied on the silver screen, the pictures, the motion pictures that were happening at the time. Bow herself was quoted as saying, "Just one place where I could go and forget the misery and gloom of home, the loneliness and heartache of school." That was the motion pictures. For the first time in my life, I knew that there was beauty in the world. For Clara Bow, everything that magic silver screen could represent to a lonely, starved, unhappy child, in her words, fueled her to go and be an actress, to not just escape into them by watching them, but to escape into them by acting in them. And this is where her love for the films first began, was due to her childhood and the abject poverty that she faced at the time. Bow got into acting through very unconventional means for the time. And it all came when Bow was in high school and she was reading Motion Picture magazine in 1921. And in this magazine they had a fame and fortune contest. Looking at this magazine, there were some qualifications that you needed in order to enter this. And we're going to look at those now. The qualifications you had to have were, you had to be pretty, young, you had to act, you had to have some personality, and you had to be able to photograph well. At the time, these were very much what the motion pictures were looking for. They were looking for young women who were pretty and would look good in a film. And of course, the prize at the time was a small role in a feature film. So Bow saw this, and all you had to do was send in your photograph, and that's exactly what she did. She was selected and had to go through a small audition process. How the auditions worked at the time were all the candidates stood by. They were called up one by one to do their audition. Bow had the very great advantage that she was called up last, so she could see what everyone else was doing as they were going up and auditioning for the judges. She watched the mistakes that every other girl in front of her did, and she said in her words that they were trying to act like somebody they'd seen on the screen, not the way they do it themselves. Clara Bow decided that she was going to do it the way she would have done it. She wasn't going to copy what she had already seen on a screen. She knew the judges wanted to see something unique. This is what won her the prize. The judges absolutely loved her because of her charm. This is because, once again, she did it how she would have done it, not how other people had. Now, the feature film that she appeared in was called Beyond the Rainbow in 1922. And when it was released, all of Clara Bow's scenes were actually cut from the film. However, Motion Picture Magazine, for winning the contest, did put up a whole article about Clara Bow. In it, they said, and I quote, "She had genuine spark of divine fire." And this was how she eventually got picked up for another film. This other film was released in 1922 as well. It was called Down to the Sea in Ships. The director of this film, called Elmer Clifton, saw her and her article in Motion Picture Magazine and asked her to be in the film. At the time, the film was absolutely not received well. The critics did not like it. However, they did like Clara Bow. In fact, they loved her in the film. And this, once again, got her even more attention. In 1924, Western Association Motion Picture Advertisers announced Baby Stars of the Year 1924. These were young actresses who they believed were going to become the future stars of America. In amongst these was 17-year-old Clara Bow. In the article, Clara Bow was described as an irrepressible brunette flapper. This brunette flapper was going to be an image that Clara Bow took with her throughout the rest of her feature films. In order to understand the appeal of Clara Bow in the 1920s, one must also understand the significance of the flapper at the time of the Jazz Age. Coming out of the First World War, women were now able to vote. They were having more freedoms because of how they helped out during the war effort. And these freedoms essentially were summed up in the flapper. Women were changing into this new girl, this woman who was loose and free and sexually appealing in a different way. No longer were the Victorian norms of high necks and long skirts appealing to women. Instead, we were having a lot shorter dresses and a woman who was able to go out and smoke and drink and dance. Now, of course, at the time, not everyone accepted that this was the new normal for women. A lot of them did not see this as appropriate for women. However, the majority of the female population were very much into this change and wanting to make this change for themselves. The flapper is very much seen as a liberated and emancipated woman. This was how a lot of women seen themselves in the Jazz Age. Due to Clara Bow playing this flapper role, she was very popular amongst the audiences, especially the female audiences, and she was becoming very much an icon for fashion and beauty at the time. From 1925 to 1926, Clara Bow was starting to see herself playing very prominent roles in films due to her popularity. And again, in these films that she played, she was usually the flapper girl. This wasn't only her prominent image, but as we discussed, very much the image of the Jazz Age at the time. Due to this prominence of being the flapper girl that was drawing a lot of attention from audiences, she set herself up perfectly for the turning point in her career in 1927 with the release of the film It. Due to the box office success of the film, Bow became universally known as the It Girl. For audiences in this time, the It Girl became very much embodying everything of beauty, abandon and sex appeal. And this was what Bow was. Bow was a loose and free and sexy woman on the screen, and a lot of female audiences wanted to mirror that image in their own lives as well. At the time, Bow was very much exploited for her popularity. She was put into very cheap films that didn't really cost much to make, but brought in a lot of money due to Bow appearing in it. Paramount thought that people would come to see the films just because Clara Bow was in it. It didn't matter what it was about or how cheaply it was made and how cheaply it looked on the screen, as long as Clara Bow was in it. However, the It Girl really did change her, this title that she ended up getting. And today we still debate as to what an It Girl actually is. There's been books written about it, documentaries, there's articles online all of what we would class to be it girls in today's society. However, at the time, the term it girl was very much about this public sex appeal, and a public sex appeal in a sense that it was very much accepted rather than unaccepted within society. This meant that she was very self-confident in herself as a woman. She was out there to pursue men. There was no waiting for men to come to her, and it was the confidence to step out of these roles that were very much what the post-war era wanted to leave behind. They wanted women to be able to have that confidence in themselves to go and get what they wanted. And I suppose if we look at Bow's life up to this point, she very much did have that confidence. Even with the Fame and Fortune contest in 1921, she had that confidence, she had that charm and that appeal that was very much what the post-war era wanted in this jazz age. Despite the cheaply made films, Bow did eventually voice to Paramount that she wanted more serious roles, and she wanted to show people her talent, and she felt she wasn't getting that chance with these cheap films. However, it never improved for her. She never got given these more serious roles. One film that a lot of people do mention in terms of more serious roles that Bow was given was the 1927 drama Wings. And this was a World War I drama, and it was the first film to win an Academy Award for the Best Picture. She starred in over 40 films in total, and this was one of her most serious roles. The rest never seen her being this serious as in the Wings film in World War I drama. But there was still issues with this film, and it still, to a lot of audiences, even with historians today, does not really show Bow's true talent. Like a lot of silent film actresses at the time, Bow eventually did have to make the transition into talkies films. Her first talkies film was in 1929 called The Wild Party, and this was actually Paramount's first ever talkies film. And despite her strong Brooklyn accent to audiences at the time, this was actually a smooth transition. However, behind the scenes this was not the case, and in fact Bow struggled a lot with this transition into talkies films. Like a lot of silent film stars at the time, they hated the sound of their own voice, hearing it for the first ever time. And I think a lot of us today are very much like that. We hear a recording of ourselves and really wish we didn't, or else we wish we could change our voice. The silent film stars were very much like this because they had never heard their voice before. Bow herself did hate her voice when she first heard it, and she was very self-conscious about a stammer that she had had in case it came through on any of the recordings. While Bow did struggle with this transition, critics and audiences alike absolutely loved her voice, and while she did have a strong Brooklyn accent, they did still like her voice, and this was something that could have gone either way for a lot of film stars. However, because she was a silent film star, one of the things that she did have to try and work on was to stop her over-exaggerated facial expressions. These over-exaggerated facial expressions were very much only seen in silent films because there was no dialogue to try and convey emotions or feelings. In some of Bow's early talkies films, you can see these very over-exaggerated facial expressions that were not dissimilar to what she did in her silent films. And while all of this was going on, this hard transition for Bow from silent films to talkies, she also had other issues going on as well. And this came in the form of magazines and fan culture. The 1920s were very much about this consumerism, and for women especially to spend as much as they could in shops. And we do see this again coming out of the Second World War as well. We see the same consumerism feeling. The films for the 1920s were very much still a part of this consumerism. This is where the turning point in Bow's life really starts, is with this fan culture and consumerism. Magazines at the time, as with now, are not afraid to make up stories and gossip about different celebrities. And eventually, just like today, celebrities couldn't manage to maintain a private life alongside a public life. In essence, celebrities became products, so whether they did films, whether they promoted a fashion brand, a beauty brand, they were the product, and people wanted to get anything they could related to these celebrities. We do see this a lot today with people like Taylor Swift that we mentioned at the start of this episode. We also see this with people like the Kardashians and of course people like Selena Gomez. All of these different beauty brands, perfumes, films, CDs, documentaries, and people just lap it up. And this is all about the fan culture and that consumerism that we still see today, but it really started back here in the 1920s. This is where the first big scandal comes in Bow's life that really brought her downfall into play. So in 1931, Bow eventually did retire after making the film Kick In. And this was due to publicised scandals, the theft trial of her secretary and close friend Daisy DeVoe, and her mental health as well. She suffered from a lot of mental health struggles during the filming of Kick In. This further contributed to her retirement eventually as well. Going back to the scandal with Daisy DeVoe saw the biggest turning point in Bow's life, and I think it would be a mistake not to mention it in this episode. Daisy DeVoe thought that Rex Bell, which was Clara Bow's husband, was going to take all of her possessions, all of her money from Clara Bow. So she decided to take it as safekeeping for Clara. However, Bow ended up suffering because of this. This ended up with a court case, and Daisy got people to read out private letters from Bow, which were private love letters to other people, as evidence. And papers absolutely lapped this up, as they would today. The papers ended up printing the love letters word for word. It ended up that Bow had a very tarnished image compared with what she did have. Stories such as these gossip columns very much saw Bow as an airhead rather than this strong and emancipated woman. A lot of the gossip that came out about Bow was true at the time, such as affairs with married men, gambling issues and debt, and Paramount tried to fix all these issues, they tried to deal with it, but eventually it just got too much. All of this was not helped by the Wall Street crash. The Wall Street crash changed everything, especially surrounding this court case. The morals of people changed and the values they held. And this is because no longer were we wanting to be emancipated and free and loose and drinking and smoking and gambling at any will and any moment. We were now wanting to be sensible about our finances. We were wanting to go back to having essentially strong moral character in comparison to what we did have. This essentially meant that the 1920s and everything that the Jazz Age stood for were now no longer compatible with the 1930s. And this too meant that Clara Bow was no longer compatible with the 1930s and the moral values that they held. Everything that Clara Bow stood for was weaponised against her in these gossip columns and in this fan culture. We were no longer wanting the free and loose woman that Clara Bow represented. We wanted to be disciplined and sensible. The flapper was essentially rejected, and this is why a lot of people do fantasise about the Jazz Age because of the flapper and the parties and the dresses. But by the 1930s, this was no longer acceptable due to the Wall Street crash. Eventually, all these stories surrounding Bow and this weaponising of everything she stood for in her films went against her to the point where she broke down and actually entered a sanitarium. Despite asking Paramount for a break, they would not give her one, and this was taking a toll on her that led to her entering a sanitarium. She eventually decided to retire at the age of 28, and Clara Bow was diagnosed with schizophrenia and paranoia. After her retirement, Clara Bow lived very much a secluded life. She never did another interview or public appearance again, and instead she lived out some of her final days in Rex Bell's ranch. If we look back on Clara Bow's life up to this point, we see her being saved from a life of poverty and a very traumatic childhood by a magazine to eventually ending up being ruined by these magazines and by this fan culture that she so admired. And I think this is what makes Clara Bow such a tragic character to look at in our film history. Clara Bow, the actress, suffered a lot in her childhood and she wanted an escape from it. And this is what the movies provided for her. However, she ended up getting absolutely destroyed and traumatised from the magazines and the fan culture that she once admired and wanted to be a part of. Looking back at our popular culture today, we can see how this would apply to, for example, the Taylor Swift song. We can see why Swift would have featured a character such as Clara Bow instead of someone else. Clara Bow for Taylor Swift probably represents someone who was ruined by the fame and fan culture that Swift herself is facing at the minute. And a lot of people do say that if we don't learn from our history, we will be doomed to repeat it. And again, with this fan culture and this obsessive nature about gossip, we are seeing history being repeated again. So I hope that you enjoyed this episode all about Clara Bow and that maybe you've learnt something new within this. If you didn't know who Clara Bow was before this, I hope that you finally know who she is and the tragic story that does surround her and her rise and fall from fame. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.